Is it just law that enlarged our concept of belonging? Or is it the work of culture as well? The arts, images, yes, literature too. Now, you've heard my bio, so you know my answer. But I'd like to tease out for you, with a few case studies, why I believe so strongly that it is the case, that culture has performed a kind of work that legal narratives alone cannot. So I'm going to trot out a few case studies, and if you still don't buy my argument, I'll try an even stronger one at the end. The first case study begins here in Texas. There's a young boy I learned about named Charles Black Jr., who was in high school in Austin and had gone on to college at University of Texas here at Austin, and he wanted to just meet some girls at a college dance, he admitted, but he found himself just transfixed by the power of this trumpet player whom he had never heard of before. Turns out it was Louis Armstrong, king of the trumpet. He stood there transfixed, but his friend to his left, he remembers, just uttered an epithet about African Americans commonly used during the day, but Charles Black Jr. was sure that he was hearing genius. In that moment, it was 1931, period of segregation, and in that moment he knew that segregation must be wrong. Because if there's genius coming out of the body of this black man, well then that must be so. Now he was young, he didn't have the confirmation of anyone around him to validate this idea, but he inaugurates that as the moment in which he began walking towards justice. Now, Charles Black Jr. would go on to become one of the lawyers that would argue in the Supreme Court to outlaw segregation. He was one of the lawyers for Brown v. Board. And he would honor every year at Columbia and Yale, where he went on to teach, the importance of Louis Armstrong for inaugurating this life-changing shift in him. Now, here I want to pause and just remind you of a fact that I don't think we discuss enough. If we don't honor the importance of the arts for constructing these national narratives that we live with, it's often because these stories are private. They exist in our students, just like Charles Black Jr., himself a college freshman, right? They're often internal, but they can become the work of these public, larger narratives. Consider it in another context entirely, the image you might teach from in history classes or have colleagues who do this broadside of the slave ship of Brooks, as it was called in 1789, that showed with graphic precision how one could, in fact, fit the legally permitted 454 men, women, and children into the hull of a ship, and we know it held up to 740. But this was the image that performed that internal work in Parliament. As historians now understand, it was the work of images, not just rational argument, that got us to slip past the back door of our rational thought that once permitted the inhumane institution, to get us to see it anew. Or consider the prodigious work of a photographer like Gordon Parks, a photographer for Life magazine and many others, photojournalist, who documented here, as you're seeing, the doll test that confirmed the deprivation that segregation meant for black children. Here you're seeing the choice that this young boy is being forced to make. Which doll do you prefer, the black one or the white one? And you're seeing what his hand points to, but you're also seeing what his eyes are gesturing to in a way that perhaps argument alone could not convey. This pathos, this pain. Now, in another context entirely, imagine just the environmental movement without the power of images. The environmental movement was galvanized through the force of this image. It had enough coalescent force to remind us in the 1960s that we were living in an environment that needed to be protected. This is a photograph taken from the near surface of the moon. We often call this image Earthrise. Now, we're so surrounded by these gorgeous images of galaxies and planets, we forget that this was the first time we could see our planet in just this way. It's an old idea, the importance of the arts for justice, and by that I mean justice with a capital J and a smaller j, how it is we can understand our own lives as being more just. And it's one that a thinker on American soil tried to get the nation to understand long ago, and that is Frederick Douglass, a man who I'm told is being recognized more and more. So I should remind us he passed in 1895, but he is being recognized more and more. He is the most photographed American man in the 19th century. Not just African-American man, American man. What did he know about the importance of images for offering counter-narratives at the time to refute dangerous and denigrating stereotypes about African Americans? He put himself in front of the camera constantly, rarely smiling, often showing himself as the prodigious orator and abolitionist that he was. He gave a speech very close to where I teach in Boston's Tremont Temple during the Civil War, entitled Pictures and Progress. It confused his audience. 1861, he spoke about the idea again in 1865 because they expected him to speak about the power of force to rejoin the American Union. Instead, he spoke for the entire length of the speech about the power of pictures. What did he mean? Frederick Douglass was not speaking about the work of an individual photographer. He never named one. But he had an idea that images can ignite a new concept of what's possible in us, can get us to see what we didn't even know existed, can allow us to do the work of examining what I might call our unknown unknowns, the blind spots that we live with and try to work out throughout our lives. He called this new image generated in us, the kind that Charles Black Jr. had when he saw Louis Armstrong, a thought picture, a new way to have a kind of critical imagination about the world. And he knew that this was a radical and difficult idea. And so he said at the end of his speech, it might take over 150 years for this country to better understand what I mean. So humble and so prophetic.